The wind didn't whistle on the edge of town. It sighed, like an old man too tired to argue with time. Out beyond the last stretch of cracked trail and leaning fence posts, there stood a ranch no one visited anymore. Its paint had long since peeled to silver splinters. The barn leaned like it was remembering better days. And the fields, once thick with grazing cattle, had thinned down to scrub and sand. But it stood anyway, defiant in its loneliness, just like the woman who owned it. The widow used to be fire. Folks remembered her riding through town on a black mare with dust in her boots and a rifle slung across her back. She was one of those rare women who spoke only when needed and made every word stick. When her husband died of a fever 20 winters ago, people expected her to sell the land and head east. She didn't. She stayed, built fences, mended roofs, raised her daughter without weeping. But fire becomes ember with time. These days, the widow mostly sat in her rocking chair wrapped in a sun-faded shawl, her boots stiff with wear. Her body had turned brittle. The cough came in the mornings like clockwork. Each time, she'd glance down at her hands, as if checking whether she still had enough time left in them. Her daughter, broad-shouldered, round-faced, with gentle brown eyes that avoided mirrors, tended the ranch in silence. She was not what the town called marriageable. Too tall, too quiet, too soft in the middle. But she knew the language of animals better than people. She fed the hens before the sun rose and rubbed liniment into the mules' joints when no one was watching. And she smiled rarely, but when she did, it came slowly and without force. The townsfolk whispered about her, called her the big girl out on Hollow Ridge. Some said she was slow. Others said she was just plain. None of them ever asked her name. The widow, watching her girl from a porch, grew worried in her bones. Not because she pitied her, but because she knew what came for women who had no one. She had lived a hard life herself, but it was shared once. Shared with a man who'd loved her in quiet ways. She wanted that for her daughter. Just one soul to look at her and see her. Not the ranch, not the weight, but the woman. So one morning, after a night of coughing that left blood on her linen, the widow stood from her chair and lit the oil lamp. She moved slowly, stiffly, toward the writing desk where old tax papers and folded receipts sat in a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. She pulled a fresh piece of parchment and wrote in ink that had dried a little at the tip. "The man who marries my daughter will inherit this ranch." 7 words. No more. She folded the paper, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked 2 miles into town. The saloon was mostly empty at that hour, save for old Harmon sweeping dust that never seemed to leave the floor and the bartender counting coins in silence. The widow said nothing as she pinned the note to the board by the door, right under a sign for poker night and just above a reward notice for a missing mule. Then she turned and walked out, her boots clicking like fading echoes. The town talked. They always did. Some found it pitiful. Others found it laughable. A few said it was desperate, as if that were a sin. One man slapped the wall and shouted, "Hell, I'll marry any ranch for a sack of flour," and the room roared with cruel laughter. But no one came to the ranch. Not for days. Not for weeks. Until one dusk, when the horizon was lit gold and bruised violet, a figure rode up through the brush. He wore no badge, bore no reputation. Just a man in worn boots with eyes like tired stone. His hat hung low, and his horse looked as weary as he did. He didn't knock gently. He struck the door twice, hard. The widow opened it without surprise, as if she'd been waiting. "I read the note," he said. "I figured you did. I'll take the deal." And just like that, a life changed. The daughter stood behind her mother, apron dusted with flour. She looked at the man with quiet resignation, as though this moment had always been coming. Not love, not even fear, just surrender. The marriage happened 2 days later. The preacher arrived from 2 towns over, half drunk and swaying. The ceremony lasted all of 5 minutes, said under a tree with the wind hushing the vows. The bride wore no dress, just her cleanest work clothes and boots with holes mended in the toe. She didn't look up. He didn't look at her. The only witnesses were 2 cows and the barn cat. They didn't share a kiss. That night The man slept in the barn. He never asked for a room, never asked for anything. He just laid out his bedroll beside the feed sacks and drank from a cracked tin cup. For weeks, he kept to himself. Sometimes helped fix fence posts. Sometimes vanished into town. At night, he'd sit on the back step with a bottle and mutter at the sky. The daughter brought him food in silence. He never said thank you. She never expected it. There was no cruelty in him, but no care either. They lived like strangers bound by paper. And then, one morning he was gone. His horse, too. The saddle missing from the barn rail. No note. No goodbye. Just the front gate swinging open in the wind. The daughter found his half-empty whiskey bottle on the windowsill, cloudy with dust. She left it there for a month before pouring it into the soil. The saddle she didn't touch. It stayed tucked in the barn loft like a ghost too stubborn to leave. The widow asked nothing. The girl answered nothing. Life returned to what it was. Only now there was less laughter and less hope. But she worked. She always worked. And every night she sat beside the widow, mending something, socks, fencing gloves, the hem of an apron, always sewing like the thread might keep something from unraveling completely. By the time the first snow melted, the girl had learned how to talk to silence. She spoke to it in the creak of the barn door, the slap of wet laundry on the line, the rustle of feed sacks in the morning. There was no one left to fill the space, just her mother, coughing soft as a bird behind the walls, and the animals who came when she called, because they didn't care how big she was or how long it took her to say what she meant. She worked. That was all she knew. And when her muscles ached, she welcomed the ache. It kept the grief from rising too fast. The widow had grown small. Her bones no longer seemed to belong to her body. Sometimes she sat in the chair and stared at the horizon for hours, whispering prayers no one answered. She asked about heaven more than she used to. She stopped mentioning her husband, stopped mentioning the man who had come and gone like a dust storm with a saddle. The daughter didn't ask. She already knew the answers. Then, one evening, just as the sky turned the color of tarnished brass and the wind began to smell like summer again, a figure appeared at the edge of the property. He didn't ride. He walked. Boots dusty, shoulders square, face calm. The daughter saw him from the chicken coop. Her breath caught, just for a moment. But he didn't call out, didn't swing his arms or wave. He simply waited at the gate like someone raised with manners. She approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "You lost?" she asked. "No," he said. "But your porch is leaning. I could help." That was all. She didn't say yes. But the next morning, the porch creaked a little less. And when she came back from feeding the cows, he was hammering a board into place, sleeves rolled to the elbows, saying nothing. He stayed through supper, though no one invited him. He just quietly fried up cornmeal cakes, stirred a pot of beans like he'd done it 1,000 times, and set 3 plates down without waiting to be thanked. The widow watched him with fogged eyes. The daughter said nothing, but he came again the next day, and the next. Never loud, never pushy, just there. He fixed the door hinge that squealed. He mended the saddle with twine and oil. He brushed the horses and murmured to them like they were old friends. The animals seemed to listen, even the mule. He brought sugar cubes for the goats, left firewood stacked neat by the side of the house, repaired the step where the widow once tripped and scraped her knee. He asked no questions, not about the ranch, not about the offer, not about the man who'd left and never returned. The daughter watched him like a deer watches a still forest, not running, but ready. One evening, the widow nodded off at the table. The man took her gently by the shoulder and helped her to bed. He did it like he'd done it before, like it wasn't a burden. When he returned, the girl had brewed a cup of coffee. She poured him one too. He smiled, not wide, not bright, just enough. They sat in silence, fire popping low. No need to fill the space. Later, while chopping wood, he hummed, just under his breath, a slow song, half sad, half warm. She recognized the tune, but not the words. Without thinking, she hummed along. Their voices crossed in the middle. The goat ate her apron while she was distracted. She laughed, sudden and bright, then caught herself. He chuckled too. "I'll sew you a new one," he offered. "Don't bother," she said. "It gives him purpose." They started sharing meals. Not an invitation, just in rhythm. He would cook one day, she the next. They didn't talk about feelings, but he asked about her chickens. She asked about the weather in Colorado, where he once lived. He told her about a horse named Fern who hated thunder. She told him about the pie recipe her father never wrote down. One night, they watched a storm roll in. He stood on the porch, she beside him. Thunder cracked, and neither flinched. "He's not coming back, is he?" she asked. "No," the man said. She didn't ask how he knew. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her like someone reading a well-worn book, page by page, slow enough to understand. She found herself standing a little straighter, sleeping a little sounder, not happier, just less hollow. It was like he was building her, the way he built the porch, one board at a time. No rush, no expectations, just hands that knew how to hold weight. He didn't reach for her, but he didn't walk away either. He stayed, through spring, through the planting, through the cough that got worse in the widow's chest. And every time she turned around, he was there. Not as a husband, not as a promise, but as presence. And sometimes that's the beginning of everything. He never crossed the lines she didn't draw. He never asked for more than a place to set his tools and a bit of coffee in the morning. But she began to notice the way his eyes softened when she entered a room, the way his voice grew warmer when he spoke to her than when he spoke to anyone else. And when he told stories, they were always short. But she listened like they were epics. They shared small things. A bent nail, he said, looked like a goose. A dead rooster buried beneath the apricot tree. A late night sorting beans in silence while the rain ticked softly against the window. Once, when she burned her hand pulling bread from the oven, he reached for her without hesitation, ran her palm under the cold tap, and wrapped it with a strip of cotton he tore from his own shirt. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stayed until the shaking stopped. She hadn't realized she was shaking. And when she went to bed that night, the burn on her hand throbbed, but it was the warmth in her chest that kept her awake. She didn't know what to call it, but it didn't scare her, not like it used to. The storm came sudden, the kind that doesn't give warning, no slow gathering clouds, no smell of distant rain, just a hard gust of wind, like the sky drew in a breath and forgot to let go. Then thunder cracked straight overhead, and the first drops hit the roof like nails. The daughter had just set a kettle on the stove when the horses screamed. She grabbed her coat and boots, heart already pounding. He was on the porch before she reached the door, sleeves rolled, eyes already scanning the horizon. "Fence line," he said. She nodded. No time for more. They ran through rising mud and flying sticks, the world lit in pulses of blue and white. The eastern stretch had collapsed, posts cracked, wire dangling like broken ribs. The cattle, spooked and wild-eyed, pressed close to the breach. One had already pushed through. He shouted. She whistled. Together, they moved like they'd done it a dozen times, though they hadn't. He circled wide, arms raised. She followed with rope, coaxing the steer back with quiet persistence. The wind stole most of their words. Rain soaked them through. Hands slipped on wet tools. But they worked. No complaints. No fear. Then, just as she drove a post into the mud with the heel of her boot, she slipped. Flat into the muck. She didn't curse. Didn't cry out. She just lay there, eyes up at the storming sky. And for a moment, just one, she laughed. Not out of joy, but out of sheer, aching weariness. The kind of laugh that ends in a sigh. He came to her side, hand extended. She looked at it, and paused. Because no one had offered her a hand like that, not without expectation, not without something taken in return. But his hand didn't demand. It waited. And so, after a breath, she took it. He pulled her up, gentle as lifting a loose root from soaked ground. She stood there a moment, heart thudding against ribs, not from a fall, but from the feel of him not letting go too quickly. They didn't speak, just walked back toward the barn, shoulder to shoulder, the rain still slapping their backs. Inside it was dim and quiet. He fetched 2 old blankets from the tack room, handed her one, and settled on a hay bale opposite. Steam rose from their soaked clothes. Somewhere behind them, a goat sneezed. A horse shifted its weight with a sleepy grunt. They sat. The storm rumbled on. And for the first time, he told her a story. "My wife's name was Ruth," he said, staring at his boots. "She died 6 winters ago. Fever took her fast. We had a farm near Cripple Creek. Too small to matter. She planted lilacs by the well and played the fiddle like her hands were born for it." He didn't look up. "I stayed a year after she passed. Couldn't stand the silence. Then I started walking, town to town. Never stayed long. Nothing felt like home." He ran a hand through damp hair. "Till I got here." She didn't ask what made this place different. She already knew. It wasn't the land. It was what the land held. He looked at her finally. Didn't mean to stay. Just meant to fix a porch. She smiled. Small. Crooked. "You did stay." "Yeah," he said softly. "I did." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Rain tapped the roof like soft knocking. She cleared her throat. "I married a man once," she said. "Didn't know his name proper. He came because my mother put an offer in town. Said any man who married me could have the ranch." He said nothing. Just listened. He never touched me. Never kissed me. Just took the title and slept in the barn. Then he left. She swallowed. "Never knew if I was supposed to be grateful he didn't hurt me, or ashamed that he didn't want to." The words hung heavy between them. She hadn't planned to say that. Hadn't spoken those truths out loud before. Not even to herself. His voice was quiet when it came. "You're not a bargain." She looked at him. Really looked. "You're a beginning." She blinked. Tears didn't fall. But something in her chest softened. Like a knot finally unwinding after years of pulling too tight. The storm slowed. Outside, the wind grew gentler. The world dripped instead of roared. She stood, blanket wrapped close. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not asking for more than I can give." He smiled then. Not wide, but warm. "You give more than you know." She left the barn without another word. But her feet moved slower. Not hesitant, just full of something that hadn't been there before. Hope. He stayed in the barn that night. Not because he was told to, but because that's where he needed to be. She sat in her room, beside the candlelight, fingers brushing the blanket he'd wrapped her in. She thought of his voice. The way it lowered when he spoke of his wife. The way he listened when she told the truth about her marriage. She thought about how he hadn't reached for her, and how she'd wanted him to. Not in body, but in soul. And the next morning, when the storm was a memory and the sun lit the world like forgiveness, they met again by the chicken coop. No words, just two people side by side, mending wire, feeding animals, and building something neither dared name. Yet, the cottonwood tree at the edge of the field had seen more winters than any soul still living in the valley. Its trunk twisted like old rope, bark split with time. The widow once said it hummed at night if you listened close enough. Said her husband's voice rustled in its leaves. Said she'd rest there someday. And so she did. She passed quietly in her sleep one morning as the fog rolled in and the chickens hadn't yet stirred. No cry, no gasp, just one last breath, and then stillness. The daughter found her just after dawn, still curled under the quilt she'd stitched decades ago, the corners worn soft from nights of worry and weather. There were no tears, only silence, and hands folded gently over a chest that had once held fire. They buried her that evening beneath the cottonwood, just as she'd asked. No preacher, no crowd, just the two of them, the daughter and the man who had become something she still couldn't name aloud. He carved the name into a piece of cedar with the care of someone splitting a heart wide open. No sermon, no flowers, just the sound of a shovel against earth. A song from a sparrow, the soft hush of grief that doesn't shout. For days, the ranch felt heavier, as if mourning along with them. The daughter moved slower through her chores. Her eyes stayed red, but her shoulders stayed straight. She kept the house clean, fed the hens, oiled the hinges her mother once scolded her for forgetting. The man stayed close, but not in the way that crowded. He brought her tea in the evenings, helped her clean out the widow's trunk, full of old scarves and handwritten letters tied in faded ribbon. He asked nothing. He was just there. Then the town heard. Word spread quick, like it always did when land and death cross paths. And one morning, the past came back. The man who had once married her for land and left without a word rode up the drive just after sunrise, spurs clinking, eyes full of smoke. He dismounted with the swagger of someone who thought time owed him something. "I heard the old lady's gone," he said, loud enough for the wind to carry it. "And I reckon it's time I collect what's mine." She stepped out from a porch before the man beside her could rise. "You aren't owed anything," she said. "I married you. That ranch was the deal." His voice rose like a storm that had been waiting years to break. "I signed the paper. You think letting some stray fix your fences means you're in charge." The man on the porch stood now, but she held up a hand. And for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. Not at the shouting, not at the threat, not at the history between them. She stepped off the porch, boots crunching gravel. "You signed nothing that mattered," she said, calm as still water. "My mother never filed the deed. The land never changed hands. You left before you could even ask where the boundaries lay." He scoffed. "I took vows. You took space. That's all." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside was the unsigned transfer. Crisp, unmarked, forgotten. She held it up. "This paper has no power. You never earned it." By now, neighbors had gathered. The blacksmith, the mail rider, even old Harmon from the saloon. Eyes watched from fence lines and saddlebacks. She looked toward them, not for approval, but for witness. "This ranch belongs to me now, not because someone gave it, but because I've kept alive." The old cowboy's mouth twisted, but his fists unclenched. "You'll regret this," he said, turning to mount. But his horse refused at first, stamping, snorting, unsettled by a voice that rang truer than any man's threat. When he finally rode off, the dust behind him felt less like departure and more like finality. The daughter turned. The man stood on the porch, arms at his sides, expression unreadable. But when she walked toward him, he stepped down to meet her halfway. "I wasn't sure," he said, "if you wanted me to stand back or beside." She studied him for a breath. Then she reached out, not fast, not desperate, and took his hand. "I want you here," she said. "Still." Still. He didn't pull her in. She didn't lean away. They sat on the porch together as the sun began to dip below the far hills, painting the sky with the colors her mother once said looked like the Lord's brushstrokes, amber and rose and pale blue fading to lavender. The man didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, softly, "Do you still want me to stay?" She didn't answer in words. She lifted his hand to her lips and pressed a kiss against the knuckles. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder, eyes closed, breath steady. Not claimed, not won, just held. And that was enough. The porch creaked under their weight. The wind passed over the cottonwood tree, rustling its ancient limbs like lullabies whispered from beyond. Inside, the fire still burned, and the ranch, old, cracked, beautiful, stood solid in the fading light. The ranch had never needed saving, only seeing. Don't wait to be chosen. You are not a prize on a shelf. You are the soil where roots take hold, and those who see your worth will build beside you.